Hello, Alyssa.
Hello, do we have a Zoom meeting
Well, yeah, we're
today?
supposed to, and I'm having a hard time. Um, I'm having a hard time. I went to the link on modules, and it's
Uh-huh.
not seeming to pick up anybody. It said I was the only participant, but I've received a message, a Canvas message from another student, contending that she is going through modules. I don't understand why it's different, the home page and modules. Um, I'll tell you what, to get both of you, I mean, because I feel badly to her, she's messaging me as we speak. Um, could you go ahead? I'm going to go ahead and leave this meeting. And can you go to the link on modules?
Yes,
Okay, thank you, Alyssa. I
no problem.
apologize.
Yeah, no problem. I was just having technical issues with my internet, so I'm like, oh, I hope I'm not late to class.
No, not at all. Don't be silly. Yeah, you're great. I'm glad you're here. But yeah, let's try to at least get two of you. So you and I will leave this meeting and then we'll go to the one on under modules.
Okay, I believe this is the one.
Well, to be honest, I left the one from modules and this is the one on the home page, at least on my end.
Okay, hold on, because I'm logged in on my phone, so let me see if I can.
If
Let me go
you
through
could go
modules.
off of the home page and go to modules and then hit the link at the top of that.
Yeah, it seems that this is
Oh,
it.
there she is. Okay, great. I have Miss Aguilar. Joanna, I'm glad to have you. I'm sorry. I tried the other one off the home page. Why they're different, I know not. I might get rid of one to eradicate any confusion. But I'm glad I have you here. So we don't need to change, Alyssa.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, because the one I went based off of was the one that says Zoom link on modules, and it's this one, this precise.
Okay. Okay.
I just clicked on the one where it says join from PC, Max, Mac, I mean iOS or Android, conference Zoom link.
Good. Good. Well, whatever it entailed, it worked, right?
Yeah.
I'm hoping that if there were other students that are trying to get on, hopefully they'll message me and I can post this as quickly as possible and give them the benefit of the doubt that they tried and give them a few extra points themselves. But I'm glad to have the two of you. Have you had a chance to look at the test questions and or the latest argumentative assignment on immigration during the Gilded Age? If you haven't, it's okay.
From yesterday or for the one assigned for this week?
Yeah, for this week.
I have not actually gone looking through it.
That's okay. That's okay. I'll tell you what, let me go ahead and share the screen so you can get a look at what lies ahead. Okay. So notice here, let's move down. All right, so a couple of these are not necessarily covered in the argumentative script, and so that's where I fill in the gap right now with a little mini lecture. So for instance, number 30 and number 30 for sure. Some historians suggest that the consumer revolution, modern professional sports, and the modern notion of leisure time were intended by big business to mitigate class tension. That is true. Some people contend that. During this Gilded Age, as we've gone over, and as you'll read a little bit on, especially number 3 of this week's assignment, you see a lot of class conflict that the immigrants were caught up into. A lot of them were, somewhat, pigeonholed into the proletariat, into the manual laboring class of the industrial economy, factory jobs, mining jobs, etc., especially like the Italians, and for at least a couple generations, the Irish. And so you have tension there for sure. You had the major, as we've gone over, the major railroad strike of 1877, the Pullman strike of 1894, big railroad strikes, the Homestead strike of 1892 on a steel plant that got a lot of attention. And those are just the most, conspicuous. There were a lot of bloody strikes during the Gilded Age, so much so that the Secretary of State in the 1890s contended that he was afraid of a revolution from below, from the working class, or a class war. So at any rate, you have that going on. And what do you know, at this time, many of the robber barons, if you will, began issuing a weekend, and for the modern notion of a weekday with leisure time on Saturday and Sunday. Not only that, you had the proliferation of a lot of amusement parks for the first time in the Gilded Age, from after the Civil War to about 1900, in the late 1800s. And so the most famous was Coney Island. You have the beginnings of professional sports, particularly baseball. College football took the nation by storm at the end of the 1800s, etc. So at any rate, some people contend in almost conspiracy theory fashion that big business was trying to provide catharsis to their workers, right? And to me, catharsis is like, it's sublimation. It's letting your anger and your negative emotions out, venting them in a way that is harmless, in a way that doesn't harm someone else. And so some people believe that they were trying to keep down trouble in doing that. Welcome, Rachel. So getting your name down. So to the extent to which it worked, as far as the number of strikes, bloody strikes declining, I'm not sure if the stats would point in that direction necessarily. And then also to the extent that it had a unifying effect on the different classes, limitedly. I would say limitedly. So professional sports, I think, is a good example. The Nickelodeons, or the early theaters, were another example, where you had pretty much an economically, diverse clientele that would come to them. But then you also had your different things that kind of developed a class identity. So like boxing, pugilism, what else? Like Coney Island and the amusement parks. A lot of them were very blue collar, and a lot of well-to-do people, they stuck to Central Park and to the operas and so forth. And so like I said, it was limited if to whatever extent there was a concerted effort to do this. I'm not sure how effective it was, but nevertheless, people contend on number 30 that is true, that there was kind of an attempt, a promotion by big business to try to give catharsis, to give release, and to try to foment some type of interclass camaraderie by offering the modern, phenomena of leisure and entertainment and consumerism with shopping malls, et cetera, et cetera. So that was intended to be true. And then you look at number 31, immigrants of the late Gilded Age were deemed as new primarily because they were not Wasp or from Northern and Western Europe. and you'll find that in number 1 and is it number 1? I believe it's number 1 and also number 3. And I think you'll find that to be true. Number 32 in the class handout, Jewish immigrants. We're going to go over that. Number 33, according to the handout, the late 19th century process of formal immigration and naturalization was, with the exception of the variable of communicable diseases, consistently congruent with Emma Lazarus's poem. We'll see about that. Number 34, according to the handout, Italian immigrants succumbed to labeling theory, becoming the criminals and violent political radicals the American public portrayed them to be, despite economic opportunities to escape the proletariat or the industrial, blue-collar, manual laboring, echelon of society. Number 35, as with the infamous 5 points in New York, the instructor noted the correlation, not necessarily causation, between poverty, marginalization, and crime. We'll talk about that a little bit with number 3. So those are the test questions, your final test questions. I usually put 5 textbook questions from 36 to 40. I like to have at least 40 question tests, and then I just give you the last 10 and make it out of 50 as a curve. But on the first test, I might even give you 15 because I did not register with the school with a textbook. I don't expect you to have the textbook necessarily yet. But what we're on now, if you do happen to have yours, are chapters 17 and 18. And so let's go to, and by the way, if I do change my mind and put 5 questions on there, when I do the Zoom next week for test 1, I will give the answers to them because again, I'll never punish you guys for my mistakes, for my failure to register the textbook with the school. So I'm trying to optimize your time to acquire it. All right, and so with number 1, right? Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, America, a land of relative opportunity, right? A land of opportunity relative to where they had come from. So when you look at number 1, you're going to see a limited contrast. You're going to see legal. Yes, Alyssa.
You're not showing us number 1. We're staring at 27.
Okay, so you don't presently see the Gilded Age assignment?
No, I'm seeing the document of the test.
Shoot. Okay, let me stop share, okay? And then let me go to the handout separately. Did that work now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you for letting me know, Alyssa. Okay, and so you're going to see a bit of a contrast. So the Jewish community in the Russian Empire, if you will, right, under the czars, the emperors of Russia, you're going to find evidence of informal or social as well as formal or governmental persecution and discrimination. They're literally going to have policies put into effect that dictated where the Jewish community could and could not live, how many of them could apply for certain types of jobs, particularly skilled jobs with skilled labor. You're going to find evidence of mob rule against them. I mean, some of the stuff, it just sounds downright silly. There was a Passover riot. They were contending that the Jewish community was celebrating the Passover, and they were killing and consuming children, Christian children. And so it goes back to the medieval, cultural tendency to blame the Jews for the death of Christ from the Bible. And it's crazy. The intensity and the longevity of anti-Semitism in Europe. But there you have it. And so you're going to see evidence of life becoming very difficult, oppressive, even dangerous for the Jewish community in the Russian states. And so it's probably not a coincidence that at that time in the 1880s, when all this was going on, many of them are going to move to New York. They're going to migrate and immigrate here to the United States, and many of them stay in New York. So at any rate, then you'll see a bit of a contrast. You'll see a caveat, a condition, right, or an exception, is you're going to see anti-Semitism, evidence of it, and it's cited in number 1 in the United States. I mean, my goodness, look at this sign here. One of them stated there in red, "No Jews and no dogs allowed." And so no doubt you're going to have that problem. You're going to have resentment. Anytime a demographic, an immigrant demographic does well, we've gone over this like with the Asian immigrants in the West, when we did the conquest of the far West, how there was a lot of resentment first toward the Chinese and then toward the Japanese immigrant and Chinese and Japanese American groups for their success entrepreneurially and cash crop farming with fruits, fruit crops, etc. Same thing with the Jewish community. When they began to do well and they began to try to move out of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, they're going to be discriminated. There's going to be resentment. It's going to be frowned upon for Gentiles or non-Jews to marry them. So it wasn't a picnic for the Jewish community. Also, you'll see evidence that when many of them first came in, they felt compelled to engage in the cigar making and particularly the textile or clothing making industry. And as you see in that picture, a lot of them are going to work in these, they were called dumbbell tenement apartment complexes, very claustrophobic, very unsanitary, work very long hours. And it was related to the old putting out system where contractors would come, give them so much cloth, and then come back at an allotted time and pay them by the piece, by the pace by which they had, developed so many articles of clothing. And so at any rate, it was not easy. But many of them did very well. When you look at just underneath the pictures there, historian Tyler Anbinder. This is called, and it's quoted in footnotes, The City of Dreams. Very interesting, factually rich book that I would highly recommend. And I largely utilized on this assignment, particularly on number 1. But look what he says here. He boasts that a decent number and proportion of them began to achieve socioeconomic mobility, often in becoming entrepreneurs or business owners, right? And many in retail, professionals like teachers, nurses, dentists, lawyers, rabbis, skilled workers, cigar makers, butchers, bakers, painters, etc. In fact, he contends that within one single generation, Jewish immigrants crammed into unsanitary apartments sewing clothing diminished by 1/4. So that is impressive when you compare it to many other nationalities and ethnic groups that have come from different nations as immigrant categories or demographics. To have 1/4 of them pretty much leave their menial proletariat-oriented jobs within their lifespan, just the very first immigrant generation, to get 1/4 of them to escape that is pretty impressive when you compare to other groups. And so it says there, within that single generation, women performing domestic work in others' homes diminished by over 60%. So over half of the young Jewish girls that had to work or felt compelled to initially work as domestic, maids, got out of that job just within their own lifetimes. Because oftentimes, right, it has taken historically 2, 3, 4 generations for an immigrant demographic to really start boasting some high numbers of people leaving the proletariat and becoming, like it was mentioned here, white collar oriented entrepreneurs, professionals, skilled workers, etc. So their achievement in socioeconomic mobility or moving up, ascendance, is pretty impressive. They went after the American dream with a vengeance, and they did pretty well. And so the argument here is that, you know, they wouldn't have been able to do this back in the Russian Empire and in the German 39 states and other areas from which they had largely immigrated. And so hence the United States was a lesser evil, as you see there in the last sentence. They still faced anti-Semitism. It was very difficult, a lot of hours, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of cooperation was oftentimes necessary. And that's another thing that I find kind of, you know, ironically sad, is that a lot of these immigrant groups from the very get-go, right, from leaving their village to, you know, living for years in the US, is so much was immediately tied to their brethren, to people of the same country, oftentimes even the same region of their same country. And then oftentimes, right, unless it's a very ethnically pluralistic country, their same ethnicity as well as their same nation, is so much is tied. Their fates are oftentimes intertwined. So news, right? They contend that some of the best propaganda or advertisements for moving to the US was in the form of personal correspondence. People from their own nation and ethnic group and region writing letters back to loved ones and people back to the same village or city, telling them, encouraging them that there are opportunities in the US, that they ought to take the chance, etc. Then you had the famous brokers, the middlemen, and the brokers oftentimes were found, sometimes oftentimes paid, and their interests were intertwined with those of big business in the US. Even the US government during the Civil War advertised for immigrants to come and labor, and even subsidized and helped certain big businesses that needed to spend big money and needed more laborers during the Civil War to try to entice them from other countries. And so it was international in character, this recruiting process. But most of the time, they utilized people with whom they could identify and who they could trust. They at least think they could trust, and that was people of their own demographic. And so whether it was Polish, Italian, Russian, Jewish, right, they would come and they would come as their compatriots and say, hey, they're with steamliners competing with one another. It went down to like 10 to 12 bucks to be able to cross the Atlantic. And, you know, even for that day, thinking of deflation and the power of $10 back then, it still was affordable, arguably. And so, and then it was initially only $4 fee to pay at Ellis Island once you were trying to become admitted into the country in New York, as so many of immigrants came from Europe through Ellis Island in New York, where you have the Statue of Liberty, you know. So at any rate, they had people of their own nationality help try to hook them up and say, here, we have reduced prices for steamship. We'll provide food and the necessities for you on the way there. And sometimes they even try to take the next step, which was technically illegal, in trying to hook them up with a job long before they even touched American soil. And so they would try to do these things, right? Then they would get there, and then they would have oftentimes these confidence men, if you will, people that were oftentimes tied to political machines. Political machine, everything was right in the parlance of machine at that time period, because everyone was so enamored or scared of machine production and the mechanization of society in the Gilded Age. So the contemporaries called it generically a political machine, when each of the major parties would form these hierarchies and bureaucracies of thousands and thousands of small and big and powerful offices, people running elections, deciding upon meetings, to, of course, those who were serving in political office. And so at any rate, the political machines oftentimes, especially from the two major parties, would try to entice them and say, hey, do you need a place to stay? Do you need a job? And oftentimes they would give the same offers to the same demographics, to the same people coming from the same countries. So my point being, right, is that they're going to be resented as not only intruders and perhaps, taking people's jobs, which is just an age-old and ageless, it's an axiom that's what Americans, and that's what many humans have feared with immigrants, is taking their jobs. But not only that, is they contend that these groups did not want to assimilate. And as you probably know, assimilate is when you drop your own culture, your own notions of normative behavior, your own worldview and values, and you embrace those of your host country and become like them, right? And people became angry that these new immigrants were already different from others, because, I use the acronym WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Most of the numbers statistically of immigration coming from the 17 and early to mid 1800s were largely from Northern and Western Europe. And of course, right, you look at the language we speak, you look at the government against which we rebelled to become independent, of course, England, or collectively as of 1707, Great Britain. And you could say that, that we've had a lot of Western European cultural baggage, their ways of doing things, their institutions imprinted on this country as the effective or colonizer over the Native Americans here on this continent. And so at any rate, with that argument, you could say that we have our own Western and Northern European ways of doing things. And so now when you look at some of the people coming, most of the people coming in the 1880s and 1890s, they're not WASP. They're not from Northern and Western Europe. They're not Protestant Christians. So you look at, the Balkans, right? Like Yugoslavia and Croatia and Serbia, etc. People came in large number from the Balkans. And so you had Roman Catholics and Muslims and Eastern Orthodox Christians, and they were darker skinned, the Southern Italians in particular, and of course, Roman Catholic. And the Jews were not Christian and religiously, by and large. And so now, right, people are freaking out that these groups are other. They're the other, right? Like in the sociological sense. And you got to remember that at this time period, the Jim Crow laws were alive and well, not only in the South, but in the North. Americans had created in the antebellum period before the Civil War an intellectual tradition excusing our, kind of circumventing our hypocrisy, because we claimed from the War for Independence that we followed the Enlightenment, right? And those were entailed the idea of human rights for all human beings, that all human beings are entitled to. But then they made the argument in the antebellum period in favor of slavery, and it outlived, arguably, slavery. Even when slavery had ended by way of the 13th Amendment, this argument didn't die out, is that certain groups are, I hate to say it, they contended less human. They're less capable of rational thought. They're less capable of independent living. And so a lot of it was tied to psychology and claiming that they were psychologically inferior, mentally, cognitively inferior. And then sadly, this was kind of supported by so-called pseudo-science in the late 1800s. You had, sciences like phrenology, phrenology, where they would study the human cranium and try to make general conclusions about different ethnic groups and different nationalities by the alleged dimensions of their skulls, and contend that some are further evolved using macro species evolution, Darwin thinking. And so they even use science to try to buttress this garbage, saying that some people are less human than others, and hence they're not, and they ought not to be entitled to the same natural rights, to the same degree of political participation, and also that there should not be interethnic sex or marriage with those groups, that those people were going to hurt the gene pool, as ridiculous as that sounds to us now. And so you have that type of ridiculous thinking going on. And so these new immigrants come, and they're clearly different. They look different. They're not Protestant Christian. And the idea was they argued nature and nurture, that they not only were biologically inferior, but they came from backward areas by nurture, by upbringing, and had not been properly civilized. And it further hurt. This phenomenon was further supported by the fact that a lot of these immigrants, circumstantially, through no fault of their own, were illiterate. They didn't have a chance to learn to read and write, not even in their own languages, much less in English. And a lot of them, of course, couldn't speak English. So they come over here, right? And it's just all these strikes against them in the late 1800s. And so as they come, a common argument found on numbers 1 and 3 is that there weren't many hands out to them. They didn't have safety net legislation yet in the states, much less in the country, as far as, like unemployment and, welfare checks, employment agencies trying to hire people, try to get jobs for people. They didn't have those type of safety nets, Social Security, anything like that, right? Much less medical care or anything of that sort. And so when they came, the argument is what else were they going to do but cling to one another? And that's what oftentimes they did. And then they were resented for doing such, contending that they don't want to assimilate. And now that we think about it, we don't even think they're capable of assimilating because they're so different from us. And so all these constituted strikes against the new immigrants as they came in. And so the Jewish community was not immune to those strikes, but they faced them. And, as far as this paragraph here underneath the pictures, you could say in limited fashion that they overcame them. All right. And then with number 2, any questions so far or comments? All right. Well, number two, Emma Lazarus, right, coming from stock of Jewish immigrants herself, wrote a poem that made it on the Statue of Liberty, right? And it's saying, right, have it at the bottom, like the key phrase we're accustomed to. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. And refuse, that's synonymous with garbage, and also with what comes out of what's excreted out of the human body. And so pretty strong language there. Come bring me your worst, right? They called it human offal or offal in the 1700s. Those that the countries didn't want. America will open up her arms and accept them freely. Well, of course, as you see in the title, it gives it away. Look for number two, contending that was not the case. And it gives a bit of a rundown as to what happened when they made it to Ellis Island. And you could say that the process was very selective, even to the point of being exclusive. And it also was very humiliating and objectifying for the immigrants coming through. I mean, look at some of these titles they put some of the immigrants under: idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, right? Under William Williamson, he raised the amount of money from $4 a person to $25 to try to weed out the poor. They even contended with middle-aged people that if they didn't feel just by their appearance, if they didn't feel as if that immigrant would be able to work in another 15 years, they would say no to that person. And so needless to say, the elderly, they had to have someone present with them that could vouch that he or she was going to support them, or else the elderly person was turned away. And then you have an element that perhaps is less severe, a little less controversial than titles like idiots and imbeciles, because, by the way, they would put an X on you that you had to carry with you if by your mere appearance you looked as if you were psychologically impaired. Also, if you were physically handicapped, they had a mark for that. They would set you aside and see if you or some other breadwinner associated with you were capable of being supported, so that you would not become the ward of the state. They increased it up to 3 years. Congress did that for up to 3 years you could be deported for any criminal activity, and also just becoming a ward of the state, not having a job and having the state, because in the 1890s you had the beginning of, we'll get to it soon, progressive laws, progressive legislation that entailed some safety net help to those in need. And so, but a little less controversial than that is you have those who had evidence of a communicable disease. They were quarantined for a couple weeks. If it didn't go away, they were oftentimes turned back across the Atlantic. Those with criminal records, they would look over for evidence of having committed or been convicted of violent crimes, and that could get you turned back. And then you have the fact that it was not always consistent. You had the variables of which Congress was deciding what laws, what administration, what presidential administration exercised patronage rights of appointments and put whom into what given position. So for instance, William Williamson was very kind of xenophobic and pushing out immigrants and making it very difficult and being very selective. And then you had Oscar Strauss on the other end of the spectrum, who himself was of Jewish immigrant stock, and he was much more lenient in his policies when he was running Ellis Island. But at any rate, the argument stands like with the title, right, is look for evidence of the United States not living up to that poem. Right. And then number three is you see the new immigrants caught up in a vicious cycle, whereby I've mentioned a lot of it already, is that they were already immediately marginalized. There was a xenophobic fear because they appeared by their mere appearance, by the languages that they could and could not speak, their religion and culture, to be just different, for lack of a better adjective. And that frightened Americans, right? And especially remember the context of all the class warfare that's going on, the tension regarding the economy, and so forth. And so you can make the argument that it was a little bit, the immigrants could be used sometimes as a convenient scapegoat for problems and issues that were going on during this dramatic time period that we call the Gilded Age. And so a lot of it is about Italians on number three, just feeling like their back was against the wall from the very beginning. You have an example of the starving poet, Pascal D'Angelo, trying to get out of the working class to no avail. He practically starved and he died an early death, trying to become a poet here as an Italian immigrant in New York, in the US. A lot of them were, felt arguably compelled, again, through the middlemen that were helping hook them up with jobs and places to live, etc., from their own country, and then the political machines here. They oftentimes lived in ethnic enclaves, right? Like a Chinatown is an enclave, right? An ethnically or nationally homogenous neighborhood, part of a city. And so they had little Italies, they had little Germanys, etc., in different areas of the major cities. The joke was there were more Irish in Boston than there were in Dublin, Ireland, and almost without exaggeration. And so at any rate, so they lived in these ethnic enclaves. And just get the picture of number three, that their back, they felt as if their back were against the wall. Their opportunities were limited. Their life was very difficult. Their quest to achieve the American dream was near impossible. And so they coped, right? And what were some ways in which they coped? Well, some of them made deals with the political machines, and in return, they voted for whatever candidates the political machines wanted. So the political bosses, right? The most infamous was just before the beginning of this time period. His name was William Tweed of Tammany Hall fame. But at any rate, they would send people into right at the arriving harbor and ask the immigrants if they had a place to stay, ask them if they had a job, and said, we could help you with that. And when the immigrants said, well, what do you want in return? How can we repay you? They would tell them, just remember us on election day. And they would come to collect that debt of the immigrants on the election days. And so instead of resenting the political machines for this distortion of the democratic process of elections, instead, right, they blamed oftentimes equally, if not more so, the immigrants themselves for selling their votes. And so it's as if they couldn't win. and then the major, like the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and some of the major labor unions, they felt as if you have to unite their strength in numbers, that was their only prayer against their big corporate employers, the capitalists, right? But a lot of at least some of the major, like the AFL, were against including into membership unskilled immigrant laborers. And so I think you know where this is going. So feeling excluded, you have the fact that some of them joined more radical labor unions that did accept them, like the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the International Workers, the Industrial Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies, and these other more militant groups. And what do I mean by militant? Is, for one, these groups, as opposed to the AFL accepted as a given the capitalist system, the wage-based system, and they wanted to fight for better terms, better salaries, better working conditions, etc. And that's it. And they were very even reluctant to utilize the strike and the boycott as tactical methods to get what they wanted. With the more militant groups, they oftentimes were Marxists, coming from the writings of Karl Marx, like communism, right? And they wanted an eventual or an immediate end of the capitalist system and of the wage-based system. They literally wanted the overthrow of that system. And so that in of itself made them seem radical to that generation. And then some of them even wanted to get to that destination, if need be, not through the electoral process, but through violence. And so you had some limited cases, the Haymarket Square riot, the attempted assassination of Henry Clay Frick, and also, actually, he was a son of immigrants, the assassin of President McKinley became associated with immigrants. And so the press ran with this type of stuff and contended, and portrayed the immigrants as radicals, as labor agitating radicals trying to implement a violent Marxist revolution against the capitalist system itself. And then when I didn't really employ the time, but I wanted to add, and you notice it was one of the questions on your test, is when you look at areas of ethnic enclaves like the 5 Points in New York, Satan's Circus, the Tenderloin, the Levee, and these other infamous areas in New York City in particular, in Chicago, etc., and the East, they were largely ethnically homogeneous areas of the city composed of immigrants, oftentimes Italian or Irish, etc. And the facts are there, including in Alan Brinkley's textbook, that the crime rate soared. Now, of course, it's going to soar no matter what demographics are there, just by sheer numbers alone, right? Because industrialization is going to bring about urbanization. And so thousands and thousands of people are going to move to the cities to find jobs. And with that will come inevitably friction, problems that the cities are going to need to address. And one of those was crime, in particular violent crime. And so some of this stuff, right, it just reads like a fictional book, like this book right here, Gangs of New York by Herbert Asbury. You just, and I'm not sure how well supported his stories are. Some of them seem, at least anecdotal, if not apocryphal, where like they were just made up. But he has, from time to time, newspaper clippings, speeches from politicians, and other types of primary source evidence to support supposedly the veracity of some of these stories and some of these actual people, actual human beings that lived. But it's just incredible. I wouldn't know where to begin in telling you some of the stories, but just, rackets of like brothel houses, for instance, right, with prostitutes, luring men in and as a trap, and having multiple people with weapons waiting for them in the bedroom and murdering them, having a way of disposing of their bodies, taking, of course, their wallet and any cash they had in the process, and disposing of their bodies. You had the renewal of the 5 points of New York, and they literally found bodies embedded in the walls of many of the buildings. I mean, just stuff that just seems stranger than fiction. And then, of course, the gangs, that some of them had the most outlandish and silly names, the Dead Rabbits and so forth, the Plug Uglies. And they would have these big violent gang fights that were very public oriented, and they were publicized heavily in the newspapers, etc. And some of them, of course, were, kind of the origins of the Italian mafia. And so, to whatever extent that is just merely a correlation, and to whatever extent there's causation there, I don't begin to know, because we have to borrow from psychology, from sociology, right? About, ideas about like groups that are marginalized, and they feel a sense of disillusionment, that they're told that the American dream is available for everybody, but they see clearly in their day-to-day lives that that's not the case. So then they go and seek alternative means of achieving the American dream, or they despair of their lot, and they just check out and they give up on the American dream, and that it emanates from that type of collective culture of poverty and despair. I don't begin to know, but we do know that in areas of some of these ethnic enclaves, like most famously or infamously the 5 Points, crime did rise considerably in the mid to late 1800s. But of course with sheer numbers as well. And so are there any questions or comments? Let's see here. So again, are there any questions? Do you feel relatively confident about the test? And we'll go through the test next week as well.
Okay, so basically it's going to be these 35 that we should be like going through like the readings and stuff and like trying to find the answers for them.
That's right, Alyssa. That's precisely correct. So many of the questions, the intended answers of them are derived from the argumentative assignments.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why I can't stress it enough from week to week. While you're only writing on one section, by all means, read and study all the sections, because there's something pertinent to virtually every section on a test.
Other question I had is this going to be a time test that we have to take, or how are we?
No, hon, and not if I can help it. I don't believe when I put the test and submit it on there, I certainly don't push anything for a time. You may want to be careful that, like, if you go away for a while, that it could end up, the time, there could be some type of time expiration and it could end up logging you off perhaps. But even then, your worst case scenario, you might have to begin again. But on the first test, I allow unlimited submissions. So you could take it as many times as you want until you ace it.
Okay. And what day do we start the test and what day do you have to turn it in? Is it like a 1-day thing or is it like a?
No,
Okay.
hon, it's the same as your assignments.
Okay.
Yeah, I have everything spaced out weekly. So yeah, you'll have Monday through Sunday evening to do it.
Okay.
All right. All right. So any other questions? Do you feel relatively well about this topic? About the assignment?
I think so. I just would like, I know you haven't graded our previous assignment of like the thesis and stuff. I did do the assignment that was due yesterday. I did do it similar to that one. I'm not sure if we were supposed to do it similar to that way, but I did do the similar formatting.
No, good. Yeah, I've only corrected one so far, and I apologize. But whatever advice I gave you, whatever my expectations were on the first one, carries through the entire semester, just with the
Okay.
exception that there's, nuance and differences with each topic as far as the content. But the expectations and the assignment remains the same.
Okay.
All right. All right, girls. Well, I'm grateful for you attending. You'll get your extra credit points on this assignment, and I thank you. And if there aren't any other questions, I'll go ahead and bid you adieu. And I wish you a good and safe week.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.